Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting panel of the Brooklyn Book Festival on the science of life. Our festival organizers are going to drop a link into the chat for you or into the crowdcast so you can see where to buy these extraordinary books. It's my pleasure and delight to be able to introduce to you the three authors of these three extraordinary books about science. We have Neil Shubin. I'm going to hold up their covers because they're all so gorgeous while I introduce them, who's an evolutionary biologist who's written this book, Some Assembly Required. We have Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, the author of The Disordered Cosmos, also a particle physicist and cosmologist. And we have Carl Zimmer, the New York Times columnist and the author of, most recently, Life's Edge. So welcome and thank you all for being here. And thank you to all of the people who are joining us on Crowdcast. Feel free to drop some questions in there. I'm going to toggle over and look at the audience questions and try to get you engaged in the conversation. So we're talking about science, discovery. We're talking about the cosmos. We're also talking about the history of life and really what life is to begin with. And if what we think is alive is actually alive or not. And so this is just a conversation that's going to span a lot of ground, and we're going to try to do it really efficiently because we only have 45 minutes. Chanda, I want to start with you because I think one of the profound insights in your book is that when we observe the cosmos, which you have been doing and thinking about, you've been thinking about the universe from the scale of the particle to the universe itself, that we are also peering, when we peer at a galaxy, we're also observing something about our own location and our own place. And that theme seemed to recur in your book as I was reading it. I seemed to just feel your sense of toggling between the very personal, how you wrestle with the legacy of particle physics and the atomic bomb project, how you wrestle with the beauty and the ugliness of science. And I want to ask you really this question about why you wrote a book like this that is so personal while also writing about the cosmos. Why was it important to kind of span the personal to really the universal?
I mean, I think the simple answer is Carl Sagan. I read Cosmos in college. I'm a little bit too young to have come of age with the original TV show, but I read Cosmos in college, and I was also starting college when Contact came out, and then I read Billions and Billions, his final essay collection, very closely. And I think something that made Carl Sagan so successful as a science writer was that particular merger of drawing connections between the cosmos and this thing that could seem very distant and abstract and far away from our everyday lives, and locating humanity and the need for a humanistic way of being in the world in that cosmos and drawing those connections in a very organic way. And that really resonated with me, and it's also something that kept me rooted in being interested in physics and theoretical physics, even when I was going through a lot of experiences with bias that made me feel like I didn't belong in physics, that Carl Sagan's writing was something that said to me, no, this is yours, you belong here. And so I think, to me, that approach to communicating to the general public about science and communicating to people who matter to me about science seemed very natural. And I think really the thing that I did differently is that naturally I have a different point of view on things from Carl Sagan because I've walked in different shoes. There were different sets of pressures on me, socially, politically, et cetera, because of my own social location, my ascribed identities. And so naturally, the story is going to look different from my perspective. And ultimately, in some sense, I wanted to write a book that could say to someone, yes, there are all of these complexities and difficulties, but also you belong. These cosmos are yours. And I think I was trying to add to that narrative from a point of view that maybe seemed more familiar to communities that usually I think are not written to in popular science writing. I think that the standard reader that is thought of when people are seeking out writers for science is, you're thinking of like white nerdy guy. And I wanted to write to Black nerdy girl and envy and their community and the people around them. And so I think I was really trying to pick up that piece and broaden it.
There's this great moment. I have to follow up on this because there's this great moment in the book that you describe, this great moment in your career that really relates to what you were saying, where Vera Rubin asks you the question that then makes you think that you can be a particle physicist. Do you mind just sharing what that was?
Yeah. I was introduced to her at the 2009 Women in Astronomy conference. And basically the first thing she said to me was, how do we solve the dark matter problem? I mean, the first thing she said to me basically was a question. And it was like, how do we solve the, I don't know, first or second, depending on how you see it, biggest problem in all of particle physics and cosmology? And she said it with such an earnestness and seriousness. There was no joke. There was no like, oh, you're a little graduate student, you don't know things, or you're a woman of color, I don't really take you seriously, which are all sorts of, I had experienced that many times over. And this was just like a total counterbalance to that. And in the moment I panicked because I was like, I don't have an opinion on this question, because I didn't even know that it was my place to have an opinion on this question. And so she was the first person who was like, yeah, you should have an opinion about that. She didn't say that to me, right? I have no idea what I said in response, but that was the first hint of like, no, you should take yourself seriously enough to have an opinion on this, because Vera Rubin took you seriously enough to think you should have an opinion on this. And I didn't immediately start working on dark matter, but that's what I'm known for now, is I'm a dark matter theorist and hunter.
Carl, I want to bring you into this conversation. Your book is driven by a question. It's driven by a question I think we almost take for granted. We all think we know the answer to what does it mean to be alive? What is alive and what is dead? We look at a dead animal, we say that's dead. We look at a live person, we say that's alive. But what your book does, and I think I have just found so eye-opening in reading it, is reveal that this distinction between being alive and not alive is much, much murkier and blurrier than most people think. Can you explain why that is and tell us a little bit about the fascinating examples that sort of draw into question what it is to be alive?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the surprising things about life is that we actually assume that the answer to the question, what is life, is going to be easy. We just think, oh, well, surely there's an answer and we'll get to it and you can say it in 11 words or something like that. And I think that we think that it should be easy because we have this intuition that we ourselves are alive. So we know that, and it seems pretty easy to recognize other things that are alive and telling them from things that aren't. And so we just have this sort of easy intuition. But in the book, what I try to do is just to get people just sort of in their everyday experience, really, just to sort of recognize that there are these challenges to that. That's actually really hard to answer that question. There's no agreed on definition of life in biology. There just isn't. There are hundreds of published definitions. They're not the same. They're all different. And there are more definitions that get published every year. So there isn't like some sort of convergence that's happening. And in fact, if you ask a biologist, like, well, what's your definition of life? A lot of times they just are like, whoa. I just study snakes or I study maple trees, and that don't get me into that, which is amazing to me because, think about chemists who would not agree on what an atom is, or in Chanda's business, like a galaxy. Well, no one really agrees on that. Although maybe there's a debate about galaxies that I am overlooking. I apologize if that's the case, but it's just strange that in biology, like life itself is so contested. But it's an opportunity to look at these strange cases that defy definition. One example is one that we deal, it's kind of the reason that we are meeting over Zoom and not in person is a virus. This virus has totally turned our global society upside down and created tremendous suffering. And what is it? Is it alive? I literally one morning had a virologist email me and tell me, of course, a virus is not alive. And every expert will tell you that. And then that afternoon, I had another expert say, well, of course they are alive, and any expert you'll talk to will tell you that. And so, as a journalist, I have to sort of convey to people like that battle, which, really, like, when you get down to it, is it's not science in some sort of like pristine sense of the word, but maybe our philosophies, our values, and so on, where we need to really understand why life is so important to us and what it means to us.
You really turned that question, I think, on its head a bit when you look at some very salient examples where we are debating what is alive, particularly with humans, and you look at the case of abortion, and when do we determine that a fetus is alive? You look at the case of brain death, and when we determine that a person is dead. I'm just curious, with all this exploration that you did into this question of what's alive and what's dead, and finding these distinctions to be so blurry, did you come to the conclusion that biology can't actually answer these kinds of social questions for us? How much do you think biology matters for answering the question of what we do about a life that's, with some functioning organs but some not?
I think that, well, I think we have to be careful that we don't kind of use the concept of science as cover, that, maybe there are, our views about life are informed by our history, both for good and bad, our, how we, our own culture and so on. And we're saying, well, that's just science, So literally, like, people, I quote someone as saying, like, life begins at conception. That's not religious belief. That's proven science. And I was like, no, that's just not true. But then you have to really dig in and say, like, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about life in that sense? If you're talking about, well, a fertilized egg is a viable cell, well, so was the unfertilized egg and the sperm. They were viable cells as well, with genetic information and so on. So then people will say, well, then the genome comes together and it's an autonomous individual. Well, first of all, it's really incredibly dependent on the mother's body. It's almost indistinguishable. And this idea that there's like a new genome. Well, the fact is that the father's genome and the mother's genome are really kind of autonomous for days. They're not united in some sort of magical sense. Ultimately, I don't think that, just saying like, oh, if we just sort of follow the science, that'll solve everything. We certainly have to be guided by the science, but we need to be asking, like, what are the real questions that we're talking about? Are there people's lives that we value, and how do we value them, and and how do we and are we thinking about everyone? Are we in the process of talking about life beginning at conception, of completely forgetting the lives of women? There is important science there, but the science can't exist in a vacuum.
Neil, I want to bring you into the conversation here, speaking on this theme of upending our conventional sort of wisdom or intuitions about science. Your book really spans the history of life on Earth, and you make some really important, I think, interventions in our intuitions about how certain features have evolved in the story of evolution of life. For example, you write about how our intuition is that feathers, or for many scientists, indeed, it was that feathers evolved in order for an organism to fly. And you correct that, or that lungs must have evolved only at the stage, or appeared only at the stage, that an organism was breathing air on land. Why was it important for you to sort of trace this history in the way you do, which I think is quite surgical, to look at these examples of where we've misunderstood, or the popular wisdom about biology isn't quite what happened?
Yeah, I've been, for the last 3.5 decades, I've been studying the great transitions in the history of animal life, several of them, used going out to find fossils and studying DNA, it's an integrative science. And I realized there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And some of these misconceptions actually relate to when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. So when you think about, when fish evolved to walk on land, when reptiles evolved to fly, and other, when single cells came together to make various kinds of bodies, the inventions that are associated with those, and there are many inventions associated with each of these great transitions that enable creatures to do new things. The inventions that herald a revolution actually arise well before the revolution in life. That is, nothing ever begins when you think it does. The antecedents are always different in ways you couldn't expect. And evolution couldn't happen in any other way. As your question suggests, if you think, feathers evolved as birds evolved flight, and lungs came about as creatures evolved to walk on land, you'd be in really good company. You'd also be wrong, and we've known that for over a century. And the reason is that, organisms are adapting to their environments, and they acquire numerous features, but some of them have multiple functions. And so when you think about the fish that are evolving to walk on land, the Devonian 380 million years ago, those fish already had lungs. Those fish already had arms and legs inside their fins. Those fish already had many of the inventions that were necessary to walk on land. What was needed was the opportunity. What was needed was the need, and so and we see this again and again and again, where features arise in one context and they're repurposed. So repurposing as the basis for innovation, repurposing, using old things in new ways, or duplicating things, or co-opting them for new uses, or stealing them from one organism to another, or cooperation, joining together in new ways. These kinds of things really underlie some of the major revolutions in the history of life, more than just say, oh, mutation and natural selection. Certainly natural selection is part of it, but it's not like creatures have to await mutations to do new things, because they already have an enormous amount of capability inside them. And that's what we see. And that issue has gotten ever more apparent as we've undergone the molecular biology revolution of the last several decades. As we learn more about DNA and how DNA works, and how genes are passed on, and how new genes arise, and how our genome interacts with itself inside, or how it interacts with things like viruses and so forth, what we find is a genome roiling with change. And that is a source of innovation. And that applies to every single one of our features as well. And there are many mysteries in the genome. Only 2% of our genome encode proteins, encode our genes in a traditional sense. There's just so much other stuff in there that has function, that is important, but it underlies, but it also underlies much of novelty and innovation. So what the book's about is really innovation, invention, and how invention comes about in the 4 billion year history of life. And there are many surprises along the way. And some of those surprises, I encountered as a student, and in public speaking with people, I try to convey them, and they're like, no way, it doesn't happen like that. Yeah, way, it does happen like that.
What's your favorite invention by theft?
Invention by theft? Oh, there are lots of them. But well, essentially, when viruses, so there are a number of traits in our bodies which are proteins that are derived from viruses, and so essentially, what's happened is you had viral invasions, and those viruses have been repurposed. Essentially, they no longer function as individual viruses. What they now are part of our genome to make new proteins. So some of the proteins involved in the placenta, for instance, some of the proteins involved in making memories, one gene called ARC. These were viruses that were essentially stolen and incorporated in our own genome.
I love it. Chanda, this is making me think about another line in your book in which you said that the story of the universe, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm sorry, I'm not going to quote directly, I'm going to get into the book, but it always ends up being more complicated and queer than we thought. I'm just wondering if you have something to comment on. Do you see any connections just in the world? I mean, we're talking in some ways about the dark matter of the genome and what gets revealed over time as we get more sophisticated genomic tools to understand the history of life. But in fact, I think you've had somewhat of a parallel in trying to understand the universe and finding it wackier than we thought.
Yeah, I mean, so like the simple like physicist answer, right, is that we teach people about Newtonian mechanics. We say F equals ma, and you know, we teach people's Newton's laws and that kind of thing. And then we say, so this applies on a certain scale, but then actually when you go to other scales, things get really weird. And then we tell people, just trust us, the quantum mechanics thing gives correct predictions, but also feels like totally nonsensical compared to our expectations of what everyday life will be like, right? So I think that that's an example of it's just weird out there, right? And then I think, you know, the other scale is that we tend to normalize what we experience in everyday life as that's how the universe is. And so we think that the universe is mostly filled with stuff that we can see, and is mostly filled with atoms and mostly filled with molecules and things that comprise humans, the trees outside my window, the stars that we can see, Jupiter and Saturn, if you were doing things right, like a friend of mine in Somerville was yesterday, all of these things. But actually, the stuff that we can see only comprises about 5% of the matter energy content in the universe. So we are in fact the cosmic weirdos. Like anything you can see is what's weird in the cosmos. So that's a real, I think, like even sitting with that really can change your perspective on like, what does it mean for us to exist? Like these questions that often really do drive why we are even interested in some of these issues, like what is life? What is the history of the universe, is kind of trying to figure out like, what does it mean for us to be here? What is the context in which we exist? And the context in which we exist is that we are made of the side stuff in the universe. And that actually most of the stuff in the universe, if we're just talking about matter, is dark matter. And we know that it's most of the matter in the universe, and we have no clue what it is. We know like very, very basic things about it. But I think that there's another angle to your question also, which is, so that's very much like the technical physics answer. Part of what the Disordered Cosmos reflects is my journey in becoming a dual disciplinary person. So I also do Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. And a lot of the work in STS is around thinking about the social context in which, for example, innovation and technology happen, and also the context in which work in the biological sciences and life sciences in particular happens. And my particular intervention has been saying, people often treat physics like some kind of exception in this work. Like there's an element of physics that isn't social because, you know, gravity is gravity is gravity, which I want to be clear, I agree, gravity is gravity, right? But how we talk about gravity and why we think it's important to understand gravity, why we choose to fund it, what aspects of gravitational research we decide to fund, is a socially embedded phenomenon. The vocabulary that we use is socially embedded. And I would just point to things that Carl and Neil both said in their answers that I actually have to say, I was kind of watching you two as a researcher, thinking about what are the socially embedded comments and context. So I think like Carl gave this really great example about conceptions of when life starts and the relative weighing of the life of the gestational parent versus the life of what may be a fetus at that point, right? And when does it convert to a certain collection of cells? Is it 6 weeks? Is it 10 weeks? And all of these kind of debates, right? That's, people say it's a matter of science, but there's a matter of social definition there that is value laden. And similarly, like I'm intrigued by, I've never taken a biology class, like a proper biology class, so I'm not going to comment on people's science, but I will say that like I'm intrigued by the vocabulary of innovation, for example, and how, you know, I think 40 years ago, Neil's framing of that, while it may, I totally believe is probably like the correct scientific framing, right? And is the best one to think about these things. also might not have seemed salient because that vocabulary was not so central to our cultural vocabulary in the way that it is. And so I think that also, so I was also intrigued by the way that Neil mentioned that the timing of Darwin's book mattered as much as what he actually said in it, because there was also an element of how was this received. So in that context, I'm thinking, for example, about race science and the way that race scientists and eugenicists latched onto it incorrectly and in opposition to what Darwin actually thought about things, right? But latched onto that as something to justify their viewpoints. So I'm very interested in the way that we bring complexity to science simply through the choices that we make and how we talk about it, how we value it, how we decide who gets to do what. And that can mean not only making decisions about, do I treat the Black student in my classroom the same? Do I respect the pronouns of the trans student in my room? But it can also mean, I think I'll give an example. There was a guy in a panel once who thought effective field theories of cosmology were a waste of time. And that was just his opinion. And that meant that research in that field got less funding that year.
I was struck in your book by how you wanted to reframe how we talk about dark matter, though you still use the term because it's how everyone understands this stuff in the universe that we don't see, but that really what's the case is that it's not visible to us. It's almost like it's transparent, like the metaphor that works better than darkness is something not visible, which I thought was such an interesting way to bring social context to your own fields. I have a sort of related question for all of you, which is really about when you write about the history of ideas, because I think all of you have done that here, sort of tracing the evolution of how we gain knowledge in an area of science. And to try to understand that, it seems to me in all of your books, there are examples of people who are perceived to be wrong at a particular point in history, and you've cleverly brought them into the narrative of the history of ideas and the history of science in your books in order to say, actually, this person was onto something. And now we know this about that. And here's what we need to know. And I'm just curious if any of you or all of you have any reflections about that for what it means today in terms of how we widen the aperture of the science we take seriously without going into the realm of, validating quack science, which we know is a danger in our era of misinformation. How should we be thinking about the fact that there are these lone voices that are often discarded at the time, and then we end up finding the trajectory of their thought to be really important? Obviously, we're selecting those that end up being important and not those that remain wrong. But I'm curious if that sparks any thoughts for any of you.
Well, sometimes I think, at least I'll just begin. Sometimes timing is everything, and social context, I couldn't agree more, is everything. Sometimes the timing is not right. Sometimes some people are just so far ahead of the time, both in terms of science and social, the social context, that it doesn't gain traction. One example from my book is this woman, Julia Barlow Platt, who trained as a developmental biologist in the late 1800s, and women didn't go into that field. And she came up with a discovery that was so ahead of its time, that was so outrageous at the time that she couldn't find a job in science, let alone academia. And she ended up moving to Pacific Grove, California, became mayor of Pacific Grove, California, and ended up saving Monterey Bay. So she did okay, and we did better for her. Knowing her, but she made a discovery that was so ahead of its time. There wasn't enough embryology around it to make sense of what her discovery was. She basically discovered a new kind of cell that makes part of the head, and it was just there was just no context for interpreting it. But in her case, also, she was a lone woman in the field, and I think she probably wasn't listened to for that in a number of ways. So I think there's both the social as well as the scientific, and the Barlow Platt example sort of exemplifies both.
Yeah, I think an example that immediately comes to mind actually is Yale University professor of astronomy and physics, Priya Natarajan. When I believe she was a postdoc at this point, maybe she was still a graduate student, she wrote a paper that talked about what the features would look like if we observed a galaxy that was dark matterless. And I think at the time, the paper was kind of like, well, that's weird. What we're really interested right now in is dark matter halos that surround galaxies, which is, we think, the general model that we teach to our students that will be taught at University of New Hampshire in the galaxies class next semester is that every single galaxy lives in its own little dark matter halo. And there are some larger halos and subhalos and satellite galaxies and all of those things, but all of it involves galaxies living inside dark matter halos with lots of dark matter in them and dominating the galaxies, right? I was just quoting this 5% statistic. And so it seems like a weird thing to model. Then I want to say 2 years ago, 3 years ago, some observations came back and people said, we think that what we are looking at, if we fit this to the best available model, it is a model that where the galaxy doesn't have dark matter. And the time period between those two things is 20 years, right? So I think that one of the things that I hope to kind of just communicate to the public and also our funders, our funding agencies, is that the universe doesn't care about our personal preferences about like what we would like to discover right now. The universe is just doing its thing. The universe is calculating. We are one small part of the universe trying to figure out the rest of the universe. And the universe doesn't care if you told the DOE that you would work it out in 5 years, right? And that means on some level, we have to be open-minded across longer periods of time about ideas and be fresh. And so in this particular case, right, it's not that Priya didn't go on to have a career. She's had an extraordinary career, and I'm lucky to call her a mentor. But I think it's also the case that for various reasons, Priya has in some ways been underappreciated. And I think that it's maybe not significantly appreciated enough that she had the prescience more than a decade ago to propose this idea that is now kind of coming of age. Does everybody agree that it's a dark matterless galaxy? No, I want to be really clear that this is actually a site of scientific debate. But to be at the point where you are developing models, where your models are at the center of the scientific conversation, is actually a pretty incredible achievement. And it requires patience. So I think the thing that I want to think about is how many people have done things like that. And I'm thinking, for example, about Reva K. Williams, who was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in theoretical astrophysics in the 90s, who were maybe pushed off the traditional research track, who were doing these kind of innovative ideas that maybe people don't know to compare their observations with these models, because these models are, the people who are responsible for them are not in the field to continue advocating for them. And so I think like a really important thing was that Priya was around to remind people that this model exists, right? So I think, you know, we can even think of less extreme examples where the person is still around, but even so, there's a marginalization of the idea that can affect the science.
Carl, do you tell these stories because, I mean, I'm thinking of Burke, who is near the beginning of your book, but do you tell these stories just because they make for good narratives, like the person who gets vindicated, or do you see some purpose in drawing out these stories for that illuminates how science is done today?
Well, actually, you mentioned John Butler Burke, a physicist in the early 1900s who claimed to have created life by combining radioactive radium with sterilized beef broth, and called these discoveries radiobes, and was feted, celebrated as on par with Darwin, and enjoyed glorious fame for about, I'd say maybe a year before it all flamed out, because he was proven wrong and wasn't willing to accept that he had jumped to a conclusion about what he was thinking as something that was at this boundary between life and non-life. I don't, in a way, like, I don't think he was vindicated at all. He was just wrong, but he wasn't the only person that was wrong. I mean, lots of people have been wrong. And in a way, like, I think sometimes there is a temptation, and I certainly can fall prey to it, of just writing about science as sort of a string of successes And if something comes a little bit early, well, it's okay because we're going to write about it now because it turned out to be right. But I've sort of grown to be interested in also the things that were just flat out wrong, just wrong, 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 and why they could be so passionately embraced at their time. Another example in the book, if you were to open up a textbook about zoology in the 1870s, on page 1, you would see what was something called Bathybius. And it wasn't even a single-celled organism. It was more like a patchwork of protoplasm that was believed to carpet the ocean floor. So this is presented as a fact that this thing exists. It has a Latin name. And this is where you start to learn zoology. And it had been discovered by Huxley, Thomas Huxley, one of the leading biologists of the day, and he championed it, and it was this. It showed, what it was like at the boundary between life and non-life, and could tell us something about how life began, but it was still here with us. Except it wasn't. It doesn't exist. It was a complete chemical artifact that Huxley himself was fooled by. Now, fortunately, Huxley had the capability to receive a letter sent from a research ship, the Challenger, and the author said, "We tried looking for Bathybius, and we actually did the experiments to look at it on board the ship rather than shipping these things back to you in London. You know what? It's not real. It just isn't real." Huxley actually didn't, burn the letter. He actually sent it to the journal Nature with a note of his own saying, like, okay, if there's a mistake here, it's mine. And so maybe that's why we still remember Huxley for his other achievements, rather than going down in flames like Burke. I think it tells us that when we get, like NASA, should look at these examples. For example, like NASA, we have probes, like, we have a probe on Mars right now that is doing some preliminary work to maybe see if there's life on other planets. Well, are we going to impose our expectations on some squiggles on rocks? Are we going to convince ourselves of a Bathybius that's not there? We need to look back at history, not just to look at the successes, but to see the blunders.
I thought that those
Carl brings up a really good point, though. Sometimes science is propelled by wrong ideas. And I'm just thinking of Darwin himself was propelled by wrong ideas proposed by opponents, but then forced him to sharpen his arguments. But there have also been cases where people just pushed wrong ideas for decades. But those ideas, just as a byproduct of pushing those ideas, led to technologies or other notions, which turned out to be very catalytic to the field in many ways. So wrong ideas, just because they're wrong, doesn't mean they're not important in the history of science.
Great point. Actually, I would love to hear an example of that, Neil. And it is those two examples that Carl brought up, I just do think are the kind of converse of the neglected voice. They're the sort of voice that gets over amplified, which seems to me to be something that still happens in science and technology, right? We end up, there can be bandwagons that people jump on. Neil, did you have an example in mind that you?
Oh yeah, Richard Goldschmidt proposed a theory of evolution where he thought that the first bird hatched from a reptile egg, that major evolutionary transitions happen in one pop, and he marshaled an enormous amount of developmental data. He collected all kinds of data on the embryology of creatures, looking to see how small changes in how they develop can bring about big changes in the adults. And so he, in proposing his wrong idea, he collected an enormous amount of data. He also managed to agitate, inflame, and otherwise sort of stir the pot in such a way among other people. So he had both produced the data, which later led to his downfall, but became useful for other ideas of evolution to show how developmental changes can bring about evolution in more gradual ways. But he also brought out the best of his opponents. He did not give up. He never, even after it was pretty clear he was dead wrong, he never stopped. He sounds a lot like Burke. And he just kept on going. But in that, he created enough opposition, but that opposition was very creative, and it brought the better out of them. So again, it was a wrong idea. He collected data to support that wrong idea. It turned out to not support him all that well, but it turned out to be useful in another context. It was repurposed, if you will.
Chanda, I was just can I just say one thing? We have just about 5 minutes left, sorry. So if there's anyone who wants to ask a question, please put it into the crowdcast. Just making that brief pause. Chanda, over to you.
Yeah, I want to point out that something that I find that is a really valuable way of thinking about things is that science is often portrayed as what we do know, but science is actually about what we don't know. That's actually my task as a researcher, is to live at the boundary of what we understand and what we don't understand, and try and push that boundary forward. And something that I've been trying to explain to my students, I'm teaching upper level undergrads and graduate students in an astrophysics course this semester. And I'm trying to train them to spend the time in the problem solving, and to talk to them really about, like, a lot of these problems are standard problems. You could probably look up the solutions on the internet, but actually knowing the final answer to the problem is not actually where the science happens or where you learn to think about the science. Where you learn to think about the science is in the process of actually trying to solve the problem. And that means working on what's wrong, thinking through something that turns out to be wrong, teaches you how to think. And actually the how to think part is very, very important. And this is something, it's important for scientists, but I think it's important for all of us who are doing this. Is just about critical thinking, right? But I think that there's also this piece, particularly for those of us who work in theoretical sciences, where we do model building as opposed to like data collection. That part of our task is characterizing the possible ways that the data might be fitted. And then when the data doesn't actually match that model, you've actually scooped out a part of parameter space and said, actually, this is a part of model space that we can say we've tested it and it doesn't fit. And that's part of doing the wrong stuff in science, is actually finding out where reality is in the space of possibilities and where reality isn't in the space of possibilities. And that means that occasionally you're going to advocate for a model. I'll just come back to this dark matterless galaxy. Maybe it turns out that there is dark matter in the galaxy. And maybe that's taught us something about how to compare that model against data at the end of the day, even if it turns out that the model is not a good match for what we think it is. I also want to point out, I'm reading Naomi Oreskes' Science on a Mission about the history of oceanography right now, which is a total tome, but I encourage people to sit with it and think with it. And there's just a ton of wrong ideas about oceanography that these physicists were coming up with all the time. And in the process of doing it, they were building incredible instruments that then went on to do amazing things. And so I think if anybody saw that Washington Post article a couple of days ago about like the fancy surfboard that they sent into a hurricane over the summer, I can't remember, it was some kind of, it had a good drone name, but it was a drone. It's a descendant of these machines that people were inventing in the process of trying to prove their extremely wrong theories about how the oceans worked. So just coming back to what Neil said about innovation and biological creatures innovating in response to the necessity of their environment, I think that, that's probably not, again, I've never taken a real biology class, but I think that that's kind of the sociological level, like reflection of that.
We have 3 questions. I'm just going to read them all since we only have like 3 minutes left, and anyone who wants to take a crack at them. One is directed at Neil. The one for Neil is, how are repurposed proteins identified? It's also making me think about the gut microbiome. How would bacteria from a mother, for example, be distinguished from another source or not self? The other, I'm just going to read them in succession here. The other one is, the NIH acknowledges that there are underrepresented groups, but I'm not convinced there are critical ways to address exclusion. Do you all have practical ways to welcome and retain underrepresented groups? And then the final one is about wrong ideas that sort of have detrimental effects to society. So I'm wondering how scientists grapple with pseudoscientific racial theories. Though they were and are discredited, such ideas still resonate in social life. How do we think about wrong ideas that have adverse and violent effects? Okay, so Neil, okay, maybe.
Mine's easy. I'll just do it real quick.
Yeah.
So it's a sequence. So basically look at the sequence of the protein and you look at it in a comparative sense. So in some of these cases, you see the sequence of the protein has a viral signature inside of it. So it's a comparative computational analysis. The protein shows you that it's been repurposed. So you have to look at the protein in different species and compare that protein to other proteins out there or gene structures that would produce those proteins. So that one's pretty straightforward.
Okay, and then we have racial theories and underrepresented groups. Big questions for like 1 minute, but so sorry we didn't get to them, but we can say, maybe Chanda, you had something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that those two questions are the same question in some sense. So one, race science and racist science requires active contestation. And that means that we need people who are invested in that contestation to be present in the conversation. And that doesn't necessarily mean it only has to be underrepresented group people. It can't be, but underrepresented group people should be part of that conversation. And the more that we are part of that conversation, the easier I think it becomes to contest the ideas, because there is less room for the ideas in some sense. The thing I just want to say about the NIH and the NSF and the DOE and NASA, you just have to fund underrepresented minority PIs. That's the way that you do it, is you need to give us the money.
Very succinct and helpful. I just want to thank you all so much, first of all, for writing these brilliant books. And I want to recommend to everyone that reading these books will illuminate you and inspire you. And I definitely recommend getting them. Green Lights Bookstore is selling them to you. I think it's in the Crowdcast. And I want to thank the authors for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.